very few people know that Kanhoji Angre remained undefeated in his career. Kanhoji, first thing we should point out, did not come from a very big, prestigious or wealthy family. He was able to usurp 200 years of Portuguese dominance of the entire coast, right up from Calicut all the way up to Surat and Chaul and Bassein. The other thing is, he was also very focused on his reputation, and he was very diligent on this matter. And it was a reputation, firstly, based on loyalty towards the Chatrapathi. So he developed this system which is called a revolver gulbutt system, where he put cannon on the front of several gulbutts that chased a Portuguese ship down in a formation. So there are so many lessons we can learn, and that's why I have spent a lot of time researching not only the man but the time, the economy, and basically his behavior, which was always practical, rational. Glad to be glad to be back with WishwaTalks, and it's a wonderful platform, and the interactive session is really a beautiful part of the format. And I think this has been very timely of you all, got back to me and wanted to take this further. And in the past couple of years, I've been asked a lot by people, especially in the corporate space, that what can we learn from someone like Kanhoji Angre? And we have a lot to learn, especially, Shrivani ma'am in her introduction mentioned how we are, India as a nation is again returning to dominant position in the world. If you look at our history, the past 300 years have just been a blip. Prior to that, India or the Indian subcontinent and empire in China, at that time it was the Qing Empire during Kanhoji's time, they were the dominant economies of the world, always garnering a share of 25% each around that, through all of civilization, you can say. And these past 300 years have been a fall. We know what the reasons for that, but we are returning to that predominant position, not only economically, but in the Indian Ocean region, in the Arabian Sea region, as the geopolitics of the world change. And as you can see today, you can say that the economic capitals are again moving back east, where they had been dominant for literally thousands of years. So let me tell you something. I mean, I've written about it, but very few people know that Kanhoji Angre remained undefeated in his career. This is a very, very special thing, very rare. I think very few people have had this ability. He took part in a battle which he did not lead, which went against the Maratha forces, against Chatrapathi Sambhaji when they fought the Siddhis. But that was the only time. And of course, he was just a young boy at that time. He was not leading it. But ever since he took charge, even as a fort commander, he has never experienced failure or a drawback, which is amazing. Even the mighty American empire, after winning Second World War, the Korean War, were humbled by the Vietnamese. And Napoleon, the great conqueror, had his Waterloo, and Hannibal was beaten by Scipio Africanus. There are very few people after him, Baji Rao, Rana Kumbha, and the Cholas, especially Raja Chola and Rajendra Chola. Otherwise, through history, there are very few people that have had this ability to constantly succeed. So he provides us with a lot of material to see what were the causes that allowed him this continual success. And so, just I've given you a background as that period up to the early 18th century when India and the Qing Empire were the dominant economies of the world. We were producing absolutely everything. The only thing we lacked were horses. Because of our humid climate, we were unable to breed horses successfully in India. Where we could, in places like Rajasthan and the drier parts of Punjab and Sindh, we did. And of course, the other thing that very quickly the technology transferred to Europe was metallurgy, which of course we were the masters of, especially, in the Vijayanagar Empire. The Wootz steel that was created, which is more famously known as Damascus steel, then started getting mass produced in the West. And we started then purchasing swords, mass produced swords in large numbers. But other than that, we were not only high consumption nation, but a high export nation. And of course, our love for precious metals has never waned. And in exchange for all our produce, we had been taking precious metals right from the Roman period. In fact, it's well known now that there are a lot of records from the Roman period how the Caesars would complain that, the people of the Roman Empire purchasing all these luxury items and hemorrhaging gold into India. And so this is the background. And let's begin with Kanhoji. Kanhoji, first thing we should point out, did not come from a very big, prestigious or wealthy family. His father was a small fort commander. Kanhoji was born in that fort, and he himself started right at the bottom. And the one thing his father, did, which is also a lesson, is that he provided Kanhoji with the best education of the time and the period of where they were. He was sent to the same Gurukul in Harnai, where the first Peshwa Balaji Bhatt went. And it was counterintuitive for someone, especially from his background, which were military, martial people, to focus so much on education. But his father provided him the best education. He was a highly literate person, Kanhoji, and this is how he started. And by the time the end of his career, he had annual revenue of 36 lakhs. With which he was financing the Maratha wars against the Mughals. The Marathas were a confederacy led by the Chatrapathi family, the Bhonsles, and many Dhanaji Yadav, and a lot of different Sardars used to fight the Mughals for the Swaraj, which had been created by Chatrapathi Shivaji. And he worked his way up. And, during Chatrapathi Shivaji's time, the Marathas were known by the Portuguese and the English as the Sevajis. But by the end of Kanhoji Angre's time, they were known as the Angrians. And he was able to usurp 200 years of Portuguese dominance of the entire coast, right up from Calicut all the way up to Surat and Chaul and Basin. And this is quite a phenomenal feat in itself. And so we can see that in his lifetime and the lifetime of his two successive sons, they became the dominant power in the Konkan. Going back to his education, not his first education, of course, was theoretical in a Gurukul, but his second education was with the Siddhis. His father had him apprenticed to a Siddhi sailor and trader. And what they would do is bring goods down the Vashishti River, down to the coast. All the produce was grown, of course, on the mainland. Salt was on the coast, but all the other produce, whether it was cotton from the inlands of Gujarat and Malwa and Tamil Nadu, was brought down to the coast. And from the coast, from these little entrepots, it was taken by the Europeans to their larger centers for export, either to the west or further east to Indonesia, what is now Indonesia, up to the Philippines and Japan. So what we can see is that it was, he was not the only player. Everyone had come in. The Portuguese, of course, were the first to come, but soon the Dutch, the French, the English followed the Portuguese into the east looking for trade deals. and ways of using the great amount of gold and silver they had found in South America. One must note that prior to this, Europe did not have any goods to trade with the East. But once they were in South America, they got the gold, they were able to come to the East and create these trading opportunities for themselves. So, the first thing after education we can see is that from a young age, of course, it is something our parents tell us now, hard work and diligence, and constant hard work and diligence throughout his life enabled him to build certain competencies and always be on the ball, looking out for opportunities, and of course, patience. His growth was slow, but it was steady. He was very goal oriented. When he was very young, he knew that he wanted to follow in the footsteps of Chatrapathi Shivaji and become a kind of Bhagyadar, a caretaker of the Konkan, and by being the Sarkhel, which was the head of the naval command. And this was something he focused on very deliberately and worked towards that throughout his life. And even before he was Sarkhel, he was actually able to perform the duties of the Sarkhel. So when it came to the time of his appointment, the Peshwa and the Chhatrapati were very easily able to choose him because though he had not got the title, he was already performing all the deeds and the necessary programs to bring about Maratha dominance of the coast. The other thing is he was also very focused on his reputation, and he was very diligent on this matter. And it was a reputation firstly on based on loyalty towards the Chhatrapati, and he was a great leader in this and exemplified the loyalty that was required to the central power to allow the confederation to work without any discord. And so he had a reputation of loyalty, he had a reputation of diligence, he had a reputation of fairness. And this was across the board, not only amongst his own people, but amongst the enemies too. So they knew that this was a practical, reasonable man who his word could be relied upon, and it just increased the speed of business, his ability to be fair and loyal and rational and practical. And as he grew in power, from a small fort commander, he grew to have control of the northern Konkan and then the entire Konkan when Chhatrapati Shahu came to the throne and Balaji Bhatt was his Peshwa. And once we have these like minded people, the first Peshwa and Kanhoji, working in accordance with the Chhatrapati, we saw the Maratha Confederacy and Swaraj have great success, which eventually led to the rise of Baji Rao. And then, of course, the Maratha Confederacy went, as they say, from Cuttack in Afghanistan to Cuttack in East India. So the roots of the Maratha success at some level can also be attributed to Kanhoji. The second thing is once he became successful, he instituted several reforms to be able to preserve this model. At that time, the Pratinidhi Pant, who was administrator for the Peshwas from the time of Shivaji, was able to, create a system, what we basically, called is a system of processes, which is something very similar to, ISO certification, where even if you are replaced tomorrow, you have all your processes in place so that you do not miss, step. There was a lot of record keeping. It was knowledge driven. They were, they're looking at data points, but they did not stop taking risks or innovating. He was a great innovator. At that time, the Marathas had small gulbats, which are basically rowboats, which was stitched with twine. And but this prevented it made them flexible, but it prevented them having cannon on board. So he developed this system which is called the revolver gulbat system, where he put cannon on the front of several gulbats that chased a Portuguese ship down in a formation whereas the first gunboat would fire onto the Portuguese ship, move out of the way, and you could tell from the first shot how you had to lower or higher, your cannon. And then the second shot was made from the second gunboat, which was then third gunboat took its place and again recalculated distance and took shots. So this was great innovation which allowed him to usurp the Portuguese hegemony in the Konkan, which they held for more than 200 years. The other thing, which is, I think, vital, was reinvestment. This massive revenue he got from dastaks, which was similar to the Portuguese system of cartaz duty of 2.5%, was reinvested into fort refortification, making bridges, making wells for travelers, making wells for horses. Much before the Pony Express, he had his riders riding hard from one point to the other, where these horse wells and rest stops were available for both the rider and beast. And so he was innovative in a lot of levels. He basically learnt with one experience. Once some of his ships were attacked right towards the end of the monsoon, and he was able to fight back. But then after that, he made sure that he would be the last person on the coast to bring in his vessels. So he would wait for everyone else to bring their vessels into harbor, because of course we have the monsoon, and in the monsoon the tradition in the coast is that it was a season where all you were unable to fight on the coast, so they would draw their ships in. So he just needed one experience to absolutely then implement those changes, which is something we see in the aircraft industry today. If you have an accident, they look into why that accident happened, and that is what he would do. If there was an issue, he would look into, he was not seeking to assign blame, but to discover why the issue happened and that it should not happen again. And the other thing is training. His own sons went through a system of training which you can find in the best hotels today, whether it's the Taj or the Oberoi. You start at every level. And this is the experience he had, starting at the bottom and working his way up. And in spite of having all that wealth and position, he made sure that both his sons, Sambhaji and Sekoji, did the same. And it is because of this that they too, in their lifetimes, were undefeated. And it was just division in the family, them fighting each other, that brought them down. But it outside forces were unable to assail them. They had to learn sailing, they had to learn about forts, fortification, about signals, and they were all given these punishment postings. Andheri was their hardest fort, but they were all sent there, to kind of toughen them up. And this, of course, is a lesson that the Oberoi Group and the Taj Group are implementing, but it is something for family companies to really think about, that sometimes wealth and position does make you soft, and it is something that one has to really always watch out for. One has to be put through the paces and be aware of all the different angles, all from bottom to top, what the experiences are. And if you're living in ivory tower and delegating everything, it becomes hard to have real life experience and ability to respond to crises when they arise, when you don't have them. The other matter, something we can as a nation learn, is that meritocracy. It is something he learned from and followed from Chatrapathi Shivaji, who was a great meritocrat, and as was Kanhoji Angre. There was absolutely no xenophobia or discrimination as to who was hired. It was always the best people, regardless. They could be Dutch, they could be English, they could be Portuguese. He would poach them, give them a better salary, keep them happy, and often through simple things like respect. Sometimes large paycheck is not enough, but feeling of community of purpose, something that Chatrapathi Shivaji was absolutely brilliant in creating, and, was able to unite the whole confederacy. Kanhoji Angre was able to implement these things. He was able to work with all the communities in the Konkan, whether it was the Bhandaris or the Chitpavan Brahmins or the Desa Brahmins or the Agaris and the Kolis. He was able to draw the Muslim population, the Topashi population in the Konkan. He was able to bring them all together. And what he learned is that, though a majority of his people, of course, as India were Hindu, they had certain festivals. So they would return to their villages during their festival. So he made sure that someone from another community was there to replace them. And then when that community went for its holy days, he had someone so he was able to use it very practically and without any kind of discrimination. And it obviously worked greatly in his favor. And of course, the Indian Army and the Indian Navy is a shining example of this, which, we have continued to practice, from the start of the Navy and Army. And so it's something that we should keep in mind. The last thing I would say is that he was a very frugal person. Today we have examples of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, about the lifestyles they lead. And of course, we have Azim Premji in Bangalore, great leaders and great examples. But I would say Kanhoji did this, 300 years ago, where it was not spent on ostentation, but everything was reinvested for the state. Even though he didn't have to. It was a feudatory system where people got in, like how a lot of people get into politics today to create wealth for the family. He could have done that, but he remained frugal and he was able to spread his wealth to all the people and create a very solid foundation for the space. So, though we are separated by a lot of time, Shivani ma'am said we are returning to a point where we are returning to the number two position in the world. And we have to start looking at the great leaders from our past and see how they behaved at that time. And so, these lessons in education, which Vishwa Talks is so keen on and is supporting, is of course the bedrock of any kind of success. Upskilling, education, exposure, driven by data, by knowledge, by self-reflection, by reason and practicality. I think the greatest touchstones and examples that we need to always hold dear to our heart. Kanhoji Angre was such a rational, practical person that the colonial system went out of its way to paint him as a debauched person. There's been, ever since colonialism, of course, economically was devastating, but there was also a narrative spread that Eastern races, the Oriental races, were not rational, were not practical. But here was a man extremely practical. When the East India Company got a bit too big for its boots, it did not attack them. He could have, they had no defenses. All he did is he went ostensibly fishing. He said, went out with the Kohli fishermen, they laid their nets, and he laid siege to what is now Mumbai, Bombay, the Mazgaon area. And so none of their ships carrying in the produce could come into Mazgaon to deliver the goods for further export. And the East India Company immediately backed away, and he showed them what their position is. And it was very simple. You are welcome to come here and trade. We honor the trade, but this is our country, this is our area. And, they have to proceed as per our benefit, So as long as he was there, we were able to maintain this. But after that, of course, you have Clive come in right after Kanhoji and during the fall of the Angres, when the British and the Peshwas and took sides against the two brothers and were able to destroy that hegemony. because of course people were getting worried that he's getting too rich, too powerful, because of course all the trade either came in through the Konkan or through the eastern coast in the Bengal Delta. So there are so many lessons we can learn, and that's why I have spent a lot of time researching not only the man but the time, the economy, and basically his behavior, which was always practical, rational. And though he was so successful militarily, it was not his option, because he was well aware of the loss in human life and expense. So, great user of diplomacy, and he would have made a wonderful negotiator against Trump in this day and age. And we will miss him, but I hope leaders of the day can learn from this shining example, a person absolutely undefeated in his lifetime and created a great example for us. And in spite of the colonial narrative trying to turn him into a pirate, we have been able to reclaim this, especially our Indian Navy, the INS Angre and, Commodore Kesnur and our other admirals have always given him his due place in our nation's history. And I think they need to be really thanked for this, that they did not lose themselves in the enemy's narrative and were able to reclaim and hold on to historical and cultural heritage. And so these, I think, are the main points that we need to take away from his experience.